Railway Conversations with Doc Frank.
Hello and welcome back to the show. My guest today is Peter Colacino from Sydney. Peter is very much engaged in the improvement of how we run projects in Australia. And he has a framework, a concept of three things coming together. One is about collaborative contracts. The second one is about productivity. And the third one is about outcomes. And if you're not exactly clear what I mean by that, then I promise you this will be a very, very insightful episode. Please enjoy. Hi, this is Doc Frank. Let me jump in here right now to tell you about a new training which is called High Capacity Signaling Blueprint. This is a very unique all-in-one training that gives you everything you need to know about high capacity signaling. The foundations where you can compare what conventional signaling is to what high capacity signaling is with all the necessary definitions. Then we look at CBTC, communications-based train control, as the prime technology for high capacity signaling and how this is done. In the third part of the training, we look at varieties of the European Train Control System, ETCS, another global train control technology, and how this can be used to achieve high-capacity signaling. And then at the end of the training comes an actual blueprint how to apply CBTC or ETCS to get a real high-capacity outcome for your railway. It's basically 3 training courses in one, and as usual for my trainings, there is a study group available for joint learning with other people taking the same training. And after the training, you will get into an alumni community, which is exclusive for my training students, where you can ask questions and get them answered by myself on an ongoing basis for a guaranteed minimum of 12 months. You can sign up on my usual training platform, which is docfranktraining.podia.com/HCS blueprint. I said it again, docfranktraining.podia.com/HCS blueprint, with HCS being the acronym for High Capacity Signaling. If it's important for you to learn about the latest trend in railway signaling, which is high capacity signaling, then this is the training for you. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
You're very welcome. I wanted to talk to you for a long time, and I'm very happy that it happens now on the podcast. In preparation for today's episode, I reminded myself of the motto for this podcast, or the punchline, if you will, which is authentic discussions with interesting people about railway topics that matter. So by you not knowing what my opening would be, that's already a guarantee that it will be an authentic discussion. There's nothing rehearsed. You don't really know what we are talking about during the next hour. The second item is the interesting people. So, I mean, if people don't find me interesting, then they don't tune in the first place. So I think the person to have to prove something is you in this case. So why don't you start talking to me about a bit of your history, where you are at the moment, where you have been before, and then listeners can make up their mind whether they find you interesting enough to keep listening.
Well, hopefully people keep listening beyond the intro. But to give you a sense, so I'm currently Mott MacDonald's New South Wales project strategy and delivery portfolio lead. So my team works across strategic advisory through project delivery, operations, commercial, a bunch of areas. But we're really focused at the moment on working with Sydney Metro. Is actually one of our existing major clients. I can't talk too much about Sydney Metro. It's just the nature of that project, but gives you a sense of where the focus is of the team. I'm also NEC Contracts Australia New Zealand Ambassador, and I work really closely with a few universities, notably the John Grill Institute, in supporting their major project leadership forum and the reform effort that's tied into lifting performance of the industry. But my attachment with the railway goes back quite some time. So previously, I've been involved in politics as a political advisor, working with Barry O'Farrell, for instance, in New South Wales. I've been involved with Keolis Downer, working on their projects, largely light rail in Australia, so G-Link and Yarra trams, but feeding into the broader Keolis and SNCF global network, which gave me some exposure to projects outside Australia, which has been fascinating. And then I also had a relatively long stint with Infrastructure Australia as the Chief of Policy and Research over more than 5 years as well. So uh, I think I'm interesting, if not unique, in that my experience comes from a number of different seats in the infrastructure community. I've had that exposure to decision making through politics. I've had exposure to railway operations and more recently in policy in a number of those different advisory capacities, which just gives you another interesting perspective on how to make sure you're delivering for the community.
What struck me is that if you look, or if I look at your LinkedIn profile, you've got 6 assignments or roles or whatever that are still current at the moment. You mentioned 2 or 3 of those, and that's really quite amazing, and it even tops what my maximum was before. I think I made it to 5 things that I worked on in parallel, including the management of my own company, which is kind of a side role while doing client work. At least that was before COVID. So yeah, so that was definitely quite impressive. And as you said, your experience is quite multifaceted. You looked at this from many different angles. With different hats on, if people like this thinking head idea. So so let's talk about the railway topics that matter. What normally happens with my guests is they ask me what they want to talk about, and then I come up with 2 or 3 rough topics that I want to address. Sometimes my guests volunteer 1 or 2 of their own, and quite often there's an overlap where it's relatively easy to agree on something we want to talk about. Now, you volunteered 3 topics that were absolutely not on my radar, not at all. And my first reaction was to push back and say, okay, well, that's your list of 3. Here's my list of 3, and now let's kind of negotiate which ones we agree on. And then I thought, no, wait a minute. Given your experience, your widespread industry experience, if you think the 3 things that you came up with are the big things that matter, maybe I should just take a backseat for once and just start discussing with those 3 things which are important for you, assuming that there's a fair chance that there will be important or interesting for others, for the listeners as well, and of course for me as well. And maybe I realize in hindsight that I should pay more attention to those topics in the first place. So the first of the 3 that you volunteered was the topic of NEC contracts. I didn't even know what NEC was, and maybe I need to be ashamed or embarrassed by that. But NEC contracts and collaboration. So
Yeah.
what do you mean by that? And just give us a bit background there, please.
Yeah, well, if you're comfortable, it'd be great to flag the 3 topics initially because they are really intimately linked and it helps to explain the focus on collaboration and NEC. So, the 3 areas that I do a lot of work in are thinking around the outcomes that are enabled through infrastructure investment. And I really would tie that to the idea that our sector culture in Australia has been historically adversarial and has risk being a low cost, low value industry. And I don't know how many times I've heard the idea that instead of focusing on value or the best response, someone assessing a procurement will focus on lowest cost and ultimately probably not end up with the best outcome for the community. So this idea of these 3 issues, so outcomes, collaboration, and productivity, is first and foremost tied to this idea that we need a step change in the performance of the sector. We need to shift away from this idea of an adversarial lowest cost sector to something new. And that something new is a sector that delivers maximum public value, so benefits for the community and users, therefore outcomes. Uh, it's not adversarial. I'd argue the alternative is a collaborative, high trusting industry where people work together to enable those outcomes. But we also need to make sure that it's not, you know, a kumbaya Kool-Aid drinking fest, to use sort of flippant language, but it's a sector that's inherently focused on productivity. It's about doing more for less and making the most of the inputs that go into the industry. So that third pillar of productivity is critically important. And particularly in an industry like the Australian construction industry, which has had stagnant productivity for 3 decades. I love this kind of notion that actually productivity in the Australian construction sector now is lower than it was when the World Wide Web came into wide use. You know, in the era that we've had this incredible access to information, we're actually doing a worse job in delivering infrastructure. And it shows that we're not using knowledge the right way, that there's a bit of closed-mindedness. So for me, in thinking about NEC and collaboration, as I say, I am the NEC ambassador in Australia and New Zealand, and my role is to support expanded understanding and knowledge around the topic. So, in that you weren't familiar with the NEC contract, I can tick you off the list now, Frank, as having some level of understanding. But really, NEC is one of a few collaborative contract forms that's available globally. It was the first collaborative contract by purpose, and it's a global contract standard. So, developed by the Institution of Civil Engineers in the UK, developed by a guy who was behind this, what might know as the iron triangle, the time, cost, scope trade-off that ultimately leads to project quality. Martin Barnes is his name. An NEC contract is inherently about shifting away from an adversarial, heavily legal based form of doing business in the sector to something that's focused on outcomes, on good project delivery, and ultimately ensuring productivity in the way we deliver projects. So, again, it's a contract standard born from the Institution of Civil Engineers, now being globally used. In Australia, organisations like Ausgrid, the CSIRO, Sydney Water, Queensland Hydro, all using NEC contract today.
Whenever I hear the term collaborative contract or collaborative project delivery, I'm thinking about alliance contracting in contrast to the normal design and construct contracts, which are traditionally a bit more adversarial, where you have quite a thick contract document that the parties sometimes use to just beat each other up with. Is it similar to alliance contracting, or do you see distinct differences between alliance contracting and the NEC framework?
Yeah, really great question. And it is the biggest source of confusion I find when I talk about collaborative contracting is an alliance is a form of collaborative contracting in a commercial framework sense. So it is a form of commercial relationship. It's multi-party, there's shared risk. They're some of the key characteristics. A collaborative contract form, as distinct to a collaborative contract model, is really something that's focused on trust. It's focused on a spirit of cooperation. It's the idea that each party will work together in order to deliver a best for project outcome. So an alliance is a very evolved version, but in fact, you can employ more collaborative principles in a traditional hard dollar D&C contract as well. And I'll give you a great example. So NEC contract has this notion of acting in a spirit of trust and mutual collaboration baked into the contract. It also has a really important mechanism called an early warning. And the way that it works is each party, both client and service provider has an obligation to notify the other if they see any potential risk to time or scope. It's called an early warning. And it basically gives you an opportunity to work together and avoid the pain. So it works a little like a risk register, is the way that you might think about it, but it evolves over time over the life of delivery of a project. And it could be we've had too many wet days. It could be we found bad ground conditions. It could be a range of other factors, but it gives you a chance to notify and then for corrective action to be taken, avoiding a potential change in cost or a change in delivery timeframe. And that very point, which is that you have an opportunity to work together, I'd argue is inherently collaborative. Still a hard dollar, still a still a D&C contract, but a more collaborative way of operating. And that relationship of working together to solve a problem is really what NEC is looking to embolden in the industry and embody. And it also makes the point that every collaborative contract doesn't need to be right down one end of the spectrum in alliance, but actually those principles can be built into uh, any commercial model through a well-chosen contract form, such as NEC. And indeed, NEC has a series of pricing options from an incentivized target cost style model through to an alliance or a hard dollar contract, which is based on fixed time, fixed scope, or in fact, a contract model which is allows some flexibility based on a bill of quantities. So there are various different pricing models within the NEC contract suite, various different forms of multi-party agreement. So whether it's a dual party through, for instance, a build-only contract or an alliance down the other end of the spectrum, all of these things are somewhat decoupled from the idea of collaboration.
Allow me to be a bit skeptical here. Um, not so much to contradict you or to say that these ideas don't have merits. They definitely sound very nice, but to kind of check this or to prove it for solidity. What I find in my own experience in the industry is that that people, and you said it yourself, people have this history of an mostly adversarial contractual relationship in projects. And what I think was what many people will find or remember is that whenever they tried to be too trustful, they were basically taken advantage of by the other side.
Yep.
So their experience is basically whenever I'm trying to be trusting, I'm getting penalized for that. I'm getting punished for that. So next time or every next time I try to be extra careful not to be too trusting and always have some kind of a safety net in form of a contract, for example, that whenever the other party isn't as collaborative as I am or as I try to be, there is something in place that I can basically bring them back into the realm of virtue. Let's just say. The other thing I think is a problem are the agendas that you often have as an undercurrent to contracts. I give you an example. In a procurement process, there are various companies normally that try to win the project. So in order to win the project, they may pretend that they are as compliant with the tender requirements as possible, and they have to come up with a very attractive price, which is often very competitive to the point that the price doesn't even cover the cost if you want to do a decent job. So that means that there are people in charge on the contractor side that basically have the remit from day one of the contract to recover the undercutting of the price, so that the price is basically not enough to do a decent job. They want to do a decent job. They don't want to cut corners, but they need more money to do that. So they basically have not just they have a remit, and they are incentivized even by, I don't know, salary bonuses, all kinds of stuff, to recover costs. How do they recover costs? They recover costs with variations. How do you get variations? You need to put claims in that ideally the other party didn't see coming and can't contradict. So I mean, I don't want to paint too bleak of a picture here, but you can see that there are all kinds of things going on that I believe makes it very, very difficult to say, okay, well, everybody stop. We're now entering into a collaborative relationship where everybody likes each other, everybody is completely transparent, and any problems coming up, we will solve ourselves. Where some
Yeah.
problems may not be of that kind. So if the contractor says, well, to make my life okay, I would need an additional $20 million from you, Mr. Client. And Mr. Client says, well, wait a minute, what additional value do I get for the 20 million? And he said, well, not much really. I just need this to do a proper job that I promised you for a lower price in the first place because I wanted to win the contract. So I think it's enough skepticism and enough contradictions. So I let you respond to that.
No, no, look, I think I mean the first thing I'd say is I acknowledge all of those issues that you've raised. I mean, anyone who's been in the Australian sector for a period of time will have witnessed firsthand those behaviours, which is either someone bidding at a unachievable price in order to buy the job, as they say, and then
Yeah.
to go through a process of variation and claim in order to recover their lost margin. Or they've seen parties take advantage of the alternate party in the contract through, um, aggressive behavior is probably the way that I would put it. And really, what I'd say is we see in Australia with, as I understand it, the highest proportional, I, I think, sorry, it's the second highest proportional insolvency of any construction industry globally. I believe is the figure I heard at the Australian Constructors Association Frontiers and Foundations conference last week, but also the highest level of insolvency of any industry in Australia and growing. So the first point to make is the behavior that we've seen incumbent in industry, and we've all seen it, I acknowledge it, is not leading to a sustainable sector.
Mm.
So whether it's the Constructors Association, whether it's Consult Australia, Engineers Australia, parties right across the supply chain, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, there's a broad call for change. And that change requires mature parties on both sides of the table. The idea of moving from the incumbent adversarial approach to another approach will require cultural change in industry, and it will require upskilling of the parties managing the contract. It does involve a more involved process of contract management. It's not set and forget or put the contract in the bottom drawer as people kind of used to like to talk about. It actually means using the contract like a recipe book to bake the cake of a successful project. Um, so your point is, uh, can we move to this new way of operating immediately? And the answer is no, it requires concerted action, including cultural change. If one party moves and they haven't secured the counterparty to act in a spirit of trust and mutual collaboration, can we expect success? No, we can expect the same level or the same type of risk that exists in incumbent contracting environment. So what do we need to do? We need to jointly recognize that there's a need for change. We need to prioritize a sustainable industry as a core outcome. So government needs to accept that lowest price is not always best. Contractors deserve a fair margin for the effort that they put into a project, and so too the supply chain deserves certainty that they will be paid for their investment of time, effort, and intellectual capital. And government needs to be prepared to bear a greater level of risk. So that could mean something uh, complex, but superficially simple, like providing information for reliance. It could involve new forms of procurement and new forms of engagement with industry. And we've seen early contractor involvement growing in the sector and equally early tender involvement. So working with contractors in order to help shape the nature of the tender process and also requirements in the commercial model. So we're seeing this evolution occurring. Uh, there may be some mezzanines, and I'd call out Sydney Water in particular. Sydney Water is the largest user of NEC contracts in Australia. They moved around 5 years ago through the Partnering for Success program, and ultimately NEC has been adopted across the organisation. The contract, in the form used by Sydney Water, has a series of amendments, and the reflection would be they've used those amendments in order to provide greater certainty to the organisation to move from the incumbent industry approach to something newer, a more evolved collaboration form. And indeed, they're using the NEC Alliance contract for the first time in Australia in the Northwest Treatment Hub project currently. Probably a position they wouldn't have been able to get to without applying some level of amendment to the contract as as the first large scale adopter of NEC. So there's this really important point that whether it's contract form, whether it's commercial model choice, whether it's the way information's provided, client organizations can only respond to incumbent industry conditions and the nature of the projects that they're tendering. And as industry responds positively to their action, you can expect to see these practices and approaches embedded more broadly. And we're seeing that with NEC today, with new organisations like Queensland Hydro and Ausgrid deploying NEC within their organisations.
How did it come that uh, you picked up this topic of NEC contracts so strongly? Where did it come from? Was it out of frustration that you saw that the conventional contracting model in the industry doesn't lead to the required results, or you've been burned a few times yourself? Was that during your time at Infrastructure Australia, where you kind of had a helicopter view on what's happening in the industry, or when did it come and how did it come about? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, no, great question. And it's a complex answer in a way. So I cut my teeth in PPPs and people like Martin Locke, who I continue to have a close relationship with through his role working with several universities in Sydney, used to often, uh, I would see a grin on his face as the third P in the PPP was kind of reminded to others as being about partnership. And the word collaboration is probably an evolution from partnership. But what I would say is a PPP is inherently through the structure anything but partnership orientated. It's very much focused on fixed scope, fixed price, clear risk transfer. So this notion of the final P as missing in PPPs is what initially sparked my interest in collaborative models. So the need for evolution and reform to allow each party that may play a role in the SPV or indeed the project more broadly to contribute fully and wholly. And I saw that through the transport sector, including on rail projects, as really being a challenge. So the evolution for me to Infrastructure Australia was then a separate call, which was for standardized contracts. So there's a high degree of cost and a lack of productivity in the sector or efficiency that comes from each party needing to relearn a contract as they move from project to project. And even if superficially there's a contract form that might be used on another project or a standard employed, quite often it's prone to a level of amendment which renders it completely unidentifiable from the original form. So NEC is a global standard of contract. It's used widely in the UK, Hong Kong, increasingly in Singapore and elsewhere. And the way the contract is devised is to allow the base contract to remain consistent and any amendments they're required to be published and visible to industry. So it helps to reduce that friction around contract use, drives certainty and a more productive outcome. And that's why I say these issues are linked, right? For me, it was really about a more productive way of industry engaging. But it is by its nature in trying to provide a better contract, more collaborative. So it really feeds into this collaborative notion and it also emboldens things like outcomes measurement through X29, one of the optional clauses around climate, drafted by one of my Mott McDonald's colleagues, a guy called Richard Patterson, and the newest addition to the NEC suite about supporting outcomes. So it's a really interesting contract because it brings a number of these factors to bear. But at IA, at Infrastructure Australia, we're interested from an efficiency and productivity standpoint, first and foremost. Secondly, because it supported a move to collaboration. But the third point is incredibly important, which is we want to reduce barriers to entry to the Australian market. We want to make sure that, that myriad of UK rail engineers that I see working in the industry today, or it could be people who've worked in a number of other markets, whether it's across Europe or in Asia, can use a contract form in Australia that they're familiar with using in those other markets, and therefore they can hit the ground running when we have a surge in the level of work that's occurring, as we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years. So the contract, by accepting an international standard rather than a state-based or agency-based standard domestically, reduces barriers to entry, increases certainty, improves project productivity, lifts collaboration, avoids dispute, ensures value for money. All of these things are incredible benefits. So actually, it's a difficult process, i.e., there's some cost and time associated with moving from the incumbent approach to a new approach, absolutely acknowledged. But once we're able to make that change, the benefits are considerable. And they're the types of benefits that, as I say, several domestic Australian organisations, like most recently and most notably Queensland Hydro, but like organisations like the Building and Construction Authority in Singapore and Hong Kong, have identified and they're now yielding the benefits from.
How do you see the chances that relevant organizations in the rail space will adopt those standards? I mean, you said you're doing a lot of work with Sydney Metro, and Sydney Metro will have more contracts coming up in the future. First and foremost for Metro West, where not all the contracts are yet let. There are still some procurements going on, and then hopefully there will be more lines in the future of Sydney Metro to really build up the network and not just keep sitting on three lines, the Northwest City Southwest and the Western Sydney Airport line and Metro West. The other thing which I would see, which is a major contractual framework coming up, is of course to do with the high-speed rail initiative here in Australia, which will be a massive contract, which will definitely involve international partners. So just sticking with those two examples, Sydney Metro and the High Speed Rail Authority, how do you see the chances that they might adopt such contractual framework, which most other people in the industry, including in the governance structures for those projects, will be seen as foreign, which they are. Yeah, they are novel, they are international, they are not in Australia. Those organizations have never used this kind of contract model before. So how do you see this happening, and where do you see this something that's feasible in the short term, say within the next 5 years, or something where you say, well, depending on the industry, that may be an uphill battle for the next 10, 20 years?
Yeah, look, I have to be really explicit. I can't make any comments about Sydney Metro in particular. It's the
Mm,
nature of the way our team works with Sydney Metro. So I'll avoid talking specifically about Sydney Metro, but I'll talk more about New South Wales government broadly. So
okay.
there is a commitment through the 10-point plan, which will evolve to the 5 principles in order to pursue contract standardisation. It's been a long run conversation in New South Wales about what that means. And ultimately, currently, it means focusing on GC21 as the preferred contract form. GC21 has been used on projects like Sydney Metro. I mean, I don't think there's anything that's not widely known by industry as to the contract form on Sydney Metro. And it's been used for some collaborative projects that the contract is not initially designed. So a contract will not ensure project success, but it can present some barriers in delivering a project through a particular form like collaboration. So I'd say broadly of GC21 that it definitely has driven a move in New South Wales to a more standardized approach to contracting, but a number of the benefits of a move to something like NEC, i.e., collaborative relationships, reduce barriers to entry, improve productivity and efficiency for people coming into the industry or project. Some of those benefits are not captured. So they're kind of left on the table, as they say. So for high-speed rail, where you don't have an incumbent contract form within the delivery authority, you have some international projects like HS2 in the UK, which uses the NEC contract suite. I mean, even HS1 used NEC in previous forms. So you have industry players like Mott MacDonald, who has been heavily involved in HS2, familiar with the NEC contract suite, using it today to deliver high-speed rail projects globally, who absolutely bring a degree of familiarity with the contract form, which might allow it to be deployed more rapidly into market. I would say if you look across the Commonwealth major projects landscape, you have projects like the Square Kilometre Array Telescope being delivered by CSIRO and UK interests using the NEC contract suite. So it's in use by federal government agencies today, albeit through a partnership with the UK. You have Snowy Hydro, which I believe used the FIDIC contract. You have Western Sydney Airport, which I believe used bespoke contracts, although that bore some similarities to GC21 in some sense. So you have different contract forms used by the federal government. And even if I haven't been precisely accurate there with my industry recall, it certainly shows that there's no standard form of contract adopted by the federal government. And NEC absolutely offers that opportunity to bring uniformity between project types, between agencies, reduces barriers to entry to the Australian market. And the high-speed rail project could play a really important role in driving awareness and understanding of the contract while delivering a relative degree of certainty to private industry participants who are bringing their high-speed rail capability to Australia. And I think that logic is part of what underscored the approach for Queensland Hydro, where many of the hard rock tunnelers operating in Europe and elsewhere were not familiar with the contracting arrangement in Australia. They wanted a contract that they understood and were familiar with, and it pointed towards NEC, or I have to say, alternatively, FIDIC, although I guess the proof's in the pudding for that agency who've decided to adopt NEC for their pumped hydro projects.
Okay, let's move on to the topic of productivity. Uh,
Mm.
I found it quite surprising and to be quite shocking, to be honest, when you said that the productivity today is actually worse than it was at the time when the World Wide Web was introduced, which was in the late 90s and early 2000s, which basically means that over the last 20, 25 years, there hasn't been any progress. And if anything, it has gone backwards. So I find this shocking, I think is the right word, because I would have thought that with all the recent developments, for example, in the area of digital engineering, the the risk of things going wrong should be reduced, and hopefully by having a common database and things like that for the design between different disciplines, that productivity should have gone up. So if that hasn't happened, firstly, would you agree that with my assumption that productivity should have gone up, and if so, what has happened in your view that has offset any productivity improvements on the technical side with better tools and all kinds of things? What has gone wrong that the overall productivity went down rather than up?
Yeah, a great way to sort of frame the conversation, just to reflect on some of those areas of clear improvement in technical applications and access to knowledge in the industry over the period. I mean, we think about BIM as one of those areas that's often referred to, and the broad potential applications from BIM as being often discussed. But the what it really points to is that the way that we are deploying these technical applications isn't in a consistent way that allows all of the benefits to be realized. Often we'll deploy a tool without the change in business process that's associated with it. And you have a nice kind of shiny model without a change in business decision making or governance that allows those benefits to be realized. So uh, at its core, it is absolutely shocking. There is wasted effort associated with change without taking the same and mirroring the change in organizational process and governance and decision-making frameworks in order to realize the potential benefits that come from the introduction of new technology. And we saw that regularly in an imperfect data environment from an Infrastructure Australia perspective, where the types of information that people might imagine is available to inform decisions is simply not there. But equally, there's a range of other tools from, at the extreme ends of the discussion around 3D printing, at a more mundane level around kit of parts or offsite construction, all of which offer huge opportunities for productivity enhancement. But there are several barriers to their use. And indeed, I was involved in a conversation earlier today about offsite manufacturing in the rail industry and the need to ensure, from a regulator's point of view, that whatever the new components and design is brought into the rail operating environment offers the same level of safety benefits as an incumbent approach. I mean, indeed, you often see new materials and new design offering safety improvements, but rather than focusing on the potential that can come through these new products or designs or features, we focus on the status quo. So I would say we need to fundamentally shift our thinking rather than looking at adding another layer on the onion with incremental improvement, having a greater propensity to take a step change, being open to thinking um, around how these new technologies, designs, processes, or applications can be employed to drive transformative change in the sector. This, you know, adding another layer, incremental approach has not achieved the progress that we thought it would. We need to be a little bit bolder. And in order to proceed down that path, we need to change perception of risk and innovation in the way that government looks at project delivery and indeed operational performance. There are very few incentives within the private sector to do something inherently differently. There is very rarely any sort of personal benefit from that, either through remuneration and pay and a bonus sort of environment that you might see in the private sector. But there's a huge potential risk if a project goes wrong or goes poorly, that you'll end up in the newspaper or you'll end up even worse out of a job. So we need to change the way that we talk about risk and innovation. We need to create an environment where, obviously, with the proper due diligence and protections put in place, client organizations in government, and for that matter, in the private sector, can uh, work with the supply chain in order to develop innovative approaches and ultimately bring them into projects and allow deployment. It's through those changes, I should say, to innovation that will drive this step change in productivity, to be clear. We need to change, we need to fundamentally be open to change and the way that we approach delivering uh, the status quo.
Mm. it it seems to me that a lot of these issues have to do with the people involved, and also with the mindset that those people apply to the projects. So what we see specifically in my niche of the industry, which is modern advanced signaling, that the systems currently being introduced in all major Australian cities are new to the market, are new to the industry, definitely new to the railway organization introducing it. And they require very, very different processes, way of operating than the old um, legacy signaling systems did. And what I find, and I've found this time and again, both in feedbacks from training courses, also in my consulting practices, is that if people keep approaching these new technologies with the mindset that they have cultivated over basically their entire careers, which were all linked to conventional signaling, which we had in Australia for the last, I don't know, probably 100 years or something like that, then definitely for the career lifetime of anybody being in industry right now, that this may actually impact the productivity and also the outcomes quite severely, simply because the mindset and certain attitudes that were perfectly fine and extremely helpful in the old world, which means throughout the entire careers of the people involved, can suddenly stand in the way of making the most out of these new technologies. So so I think, and you kind of, or I think I heard this from your last response as well, that there needs to be a culture shift, there needs to be a culture change towards a different handling, I would say, not just a different understanding of risk and innovation, but also a different handling of risk and innovation. I'm just wondering how this is supposed to happen. So in my specific
Yeah.
example, there is nothing, or there was nothing in the world which actually addressed this issue, simply because I think it's a relatively new finding that not too many people have really cultivated. And what I did in response was developing a training course which tries to help with this transition from the old mindset by demonstrating how this is no longer useful, and in some instances even counterproductive to what you want to achieve with the new technology. The transition from that old mindset, which I call legacy mindset, to a new mindset, which I call high capacity mindset, because I'm mainly involved with new signaling systems that are there to increase capacity in city railways. So this is something that I have tried from my limited perspective and viewpoint. But what I find at the same time is that the uptake of that training is not very high, not very much. Maybe simply because it's too new of a concept, and that too many people say, well, thanks very much. My mindset was perfectly fine through my entire career. Nothing needs to be fixed, nothing needs to be changed. I don't even want to talk about it. I don't even want to discuss it. I don't even want to be open for the possibility that something in my thinking, which was fine in the past, may not be that useful in the future. So coming back to you on a wider, more global industry perspective, what possibilities do you see to to instigate and drive forward such a culture change?
Yeah. I mean, to part of your introduction there or your commentary, I'd say that we very much have a this is the way we've always done it culture in Australian
Yes.
industry, particularly the construction sector. Although we do see it in operations, but perhaps less so. And I think back on some of my career, particularly my involvement with the NRMA, an organization that uh, over a century old, very much tied to sort of a grease under the fingernails style mentality of roadside assistance and service centers. was incredibly bold in reaching into autonomous, connected, shared, and electric vehicles, delivered the largest electric vehicle charging network in the country at the time, the first autonomous vehicle in New South Wales, deployed connected car devices, and ultimately, whether it's a shared caravan or supporting Airtasker in their development, NRMA has lent into the changing sector. So the very first point is, why did the NRMA change their view? And I believe, it certainly was my experience at the time, that they rethought what they were trying to do as a mutual, a member-owned organization, which was to make the lives for individuals outside of their home simpler, easier, and more enjoyable. So they rethought or reconnected perhaps with who they were as an organization, and they realized they weren't about cars, they were about people and their experience traveling through the community. And they wanted to reconnect with that outcome of making that experience as productive and enjoyable as possible. So this outcomes piece is really critical in this context. And in rethinking their role in that value chain, rather than, if you like, a traditional view of productivity, how quickly can we get out to you? How quickly can we fix your car? They started thinking about how could they more effectively realize that outcome for people of a great journey. And if I take that across to an infrastructure conversation and sort of change the hat a little bit and think about an organization like Keolis Downer. Keolis Downer in Australia, initially an organization very closely tied to the light rail network. Instead of thinking about the trip that someone takes, i.e., when they get on and off the tram, started thinking about the journey from door to door, and their think like a passenger mentality was really tied to a similar notion. And in the way that they think about what they do as a light rail operator, they started to change their mindset to be more about passenger journeys and their role within there around connecting modes, improving experience, and adding additional value. So that type of approach that we've seen in operators and around bringing new technology and new approaches into service delivery, there's a need to take that mentality, and it's very adjacent to project delivery, but into the project delivery space. So to take this mindset that we're not about concrete and steel, or even about signaling systems and, bits and data. What we're about is better services for passengers or better services for infrastructure users, and to really shift the mindset to trying to create outcomes-based measurement and allowing flexibility in the way that those outcomes are delivered, either through designing solutions or operating networks. And that really, it seems perhaps simple. Hopefully it does after my explanation, but it's a large mindset shift. It's a really large mindset shift for people out on project to place a similar level of emphasis on disruption to the existing network as the investment in future capacity. It's a really difficult concept, even for, I mean, the fire brigade, right, who come to put out a house fire but might park their fire engine in the middle of the street, creating traffic disruption. So it's this holistic mindset of thinking about the effects of your action on the community. It's really incredibly important. And if we take that thinking into project design, if we then embody it in the methodologies that we use for project delivery, and if we continue to refine our processes in order to minimize impact, then ultimately we can unlock large benefits for the community. So what we've seen in lots of different networks who operate well is a move away from large project delivery to thinking about non-build solutions, thinking about price, thinking about operational efficiency, like the signaling improvements that you've mentioned, all of which have our networks deliver better services rather than necessarily shinier assets. And that change is the really significant change that needs to occur in the sector.
It's interesting. I was just the other day interviewed by Informa
about CBTC, and I got two questions that looked almost identical at first glance. The first one was what the benefits of CBTC are, and to me that was obviously the benefits that CBTC as an advanced digital signaling technology brings to the railway authority. And then there was a second question: what benefits does CBTC bring to the passenger traveling on the train? And what it did at the end of the day, the answers were kind of similar, because you can't invent additional benefits that are completely irrelevant for the rail operator, but are super important for the passenger, and vice versa. So at the end of the day, the technology CBTC has certain benefits that it brings to the table, but I think the difference between the two answers was really the perspective looking at those benefits. Like, what aspects of those benefits are relevant from a railway operational point of view, and from that operational use of the benefits, what was the outcome for the passengers, right? And um, and that probably is kind of a segue into the third of your topics, if you have a few more minutes to talk about that. And that was that whole topic of outcomes and outcomes based decision making. I think a major challenge there is to identify what is the real outcome. So, or in other words, who is the customer? And then really stick to it. Not just saying some of these I don't know, word balloons, like most companies say, our most important asset are our people. But then you see how they treat their employees, and they said, yeah, you may have said that, but I don't really think you act like it. You don't really walk the walk. So what can be done in your view, in your perspective, um, to focus more on the outcomes, to identify the right outcomes, or say the most relevant outcomes, which may not be the obvious ones, and then to really keep them front of mind, even that they say, well, me as the project sponsor or the client of on the contractual point of view, I'm not really the end customer for that. Or maybe some of my stuff is, but there is another customer sitting in the background that has nothing to do with the contract, but they will still be the beneficiaries, important beneficiaries of the project outcome. What can be done there, and how would you see the best approach to foster a more outcomes based decision making?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And the first point that I like to point to in talking about this idea of outcomes is, what is the role of the project in defining outcomes? And I often speak to project professionals who say, oh, our starting point is we need to decide what the project's all about. Well, I would argue already failed. Projects are interventions in systems, is the way that uh, a lot of the academic literature is now starting to speak about them. And it's the way that organizations like the Infrastructure and Projects Authority in the UK, through their Transforming Infrastructure Performance 2030 roadmap, which is well worth a look to anyone who's interested in great infrastructure sector policy, talks about the way projects should be considered. It's actually the role of a central government, i.e., the elected officials and decision makers, to define the balance or the relativity or weightings between different outcomes of the actions of the government, and through them and through ministers to um, core departments to define areas of impact in their portfolio. And they should go to the effort of understanding relativity. And for instance, we're seeing a lot of conversation today in Australia, housing and by extension, homelessness as critical issues. There's a really clear role for transport departments to play in thinking about where people live, because you need to also consider how they move around. But what level of relativity is an outcome like that against another outcome like reducing the carbon consumption in the transport network, and indeed the embodied carbon in project delivery. So it's really important that government can start to define outcomes, that they can understand the contribution or balance between different portfolios and agencies, and then through there, the relativity of the contribution of an individual project. Because you might find, for argument's sake, a very large dam, which is incredibly intensive of both concrete and steel, will actually have a very high embodied carbon, but reduce the operational carbon that might come even from the rail network through the use of renewable energy rather than coal-based energy generation to power the railway network. So you need to think really quite broadly in this space and think about the relativity and trade-offs. So this point around, if you like, corporate governance, and above that, the role in government of decision makers like elected officials in defining outcomes is incredibly important. And then through a concept often referred to as the golden thread, the relativity of those outcomes to each project and thinking of them across a balanced scorecard rather than thinking about a sole project outcome like reduced travel times really needs to be well understood and embodied, firstly through a business case to allow consideration of options and then ultimately an informed investment. And I can absolutely say with great confidence, the level of analysis across each of those concepts in business cases is not where it should be in Australia, nor is the level of definition of central government outcomes and then the relativity of those through organizations and projects. There is still some great work that we can do to strengthen the focus on those issues. And then, as I've mentioned, once you understand that context and relativity, each of the players in the supply chain, whether it's contractors, whether it's component producers, whether it's designers or others, can play their important role in driving those outcomes with a degree of confidence that the value that they offer will be well perceived during a procurement process, as we discussed earlier around productivity. And that the investment that they make or the risk they might be prepared to expose themselves to would be valued by a client. So you have this virtuous environment where clearly defined outcomes shared through a collaborative framework with industry, a greater clarity of where risk tolerance, particularly around innovation, might sit, the relativity of effort, so productivity, to deliver those outcomes is well understood, drives a much more virtuous, a much, if you like, higher value construction and major project industry, and why reform in each of those areas is so closely tied, and why I'm interested equally in all three of them. And I'd argue in the rail space in particular, tying into some of these bigger concepts around net zero and carbon, around resilience, around housing and settlement are incredibly important issues for the rail industry. And just to make that point in a very pointed way, if we were to favour regional development outside of our existing largest cities, fast rail indeed would be highly valued. It connects our regions very quickly to our centres of industry. Whereas if we were to favour development in cities, either the missing middle or even in the outer peri-urban suburbs, then transport modes like suburban rail or like metro is where you would spend the dollars. So thinking really carefully about settlement conversations, about the outcomes we want to unlock in terms of standard of living, well-being and quality of life are really critical to an industry like rail and drive fundamentally different project decisions.
Yes, I can certainly subscribe to that last point. Not that I didn't subscribe to the others that you mentioned, but I had several discussions on high-speed rail on the podcast recently, and one thing that came out very, very clear, especially in order to define the outcomes, you've got to have an idea not just where people live today, which is relatively straightforward, but where people will need to live in 20 or 30 or 40 years from now, given the likely population growth that we are forecasting here in Australia, and also given the fact that not all of these people will be able to live in Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane along the east coast, simply because those cities will burst out of the seams. So and it's kind of baffling that the High Speed Rail Authority at the moment goes straight into a business case development for Sydney to Newcastle, which isn't their fault, it's their remit by government. But they do that without really having such a settlement strategy or a forecast where people will live in the future. I I think I heard that they want to work on that in parallel, but it's not their number one priority. So there's a fair risk that they work on something, probably hoping that that will be all right anyway, because Sydney to Newcastle, well, Sydney remains one of the biggest to two biggest cities in Australia, and Newcastle will remain to be the biggest regional center in New South Wales, apart from Sydney. So they may say, well, whatever the future population will look like, Sydney and Newcastle and the connection between the two definitely will have a place, and the area in between the Central Coast will be just as important. So maybe that's the rationale. But I think with regards to everything else, to a wider idea of starting in Melbourne and then going via Canberra to Sydney, further on to Brisbane, you've got to identify where that railway needs to go, and with the objective of opening up regional areas that may maybe not even exist at the moment, right? So the other thing
Yeah,
that
look,
I came to my mind regarding outcomes, I think another word of outcomes that you find often in business cases is benefits. And
yeah,
what I often find is that the people writing the business cases or developing the inputs for business cases, they say, well, as a general term, having 25 benefits is better than having three benefits, right? So they basically stack all kinds of benefits on top of each other. And I think a big issue with that is that it leads to a vast cloud of benefits, and people get lost in the woods. They don't pare it back. I'm not saying these benefits are not relevant and they shouldn't be added up, because the more benefits you have that are can be quantified, the better your business case will be. But at the end of the day, I think it will come down to probably two or three main benefits or main outcomes that are more important than everything else, where you can basically say almost the flip side: if you don't achieve those two or three things, your project will be considered a failure. And I think often that's overlooked, where people think, oh well, if I don't do one of these three things but I do 15 others, everything will be fine. That will be kind of a compensation also, and I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's justified.
yeah. Look, just to make that point, I'd point to a document called the Reform Priority List that was developed at Infrastructure Australia when I was part of their team, which looked across each of the recommendations in the Australian Infrastructure Plan, noting they're not project-based, they're policy-based, but examined against a series of consistent measures the relative trade-off of performance. So it would consider environmental outcomes against improvements in governance or economic outcomes, or indeed social outcomes, and cost and time and other factors across the operation of the network, cost to users, if you like. So it is possible to understand relativity and to pick a defined set of outcomes that you measure against, and equally a defined set of scenarios to test each project against and consider the cumulative impact. But you really have to start at that point of saying, at the center of government, understanding the relativity of performance is critical. An investment in, for instance, a new school in a community versus a better road to move students to a neighboring area versus a digital investment so that students can study at home. The relativity of those investments and the role that they play in delivering a set of pre-prescribed outcomes is incredibly important. If we have a environment where agencies and departments exist in their own silos, working at their own rate, you could have to some of those decisions around settlement and investment in hospitals in one community, an investment in schools somewhere else, an investment in telecommunications in a third community altogether different. So you do need some level of unifying understanding of trends around settlement. My understanding, I have to say, is that the High Speed Rail Authority and others are focused on this issue. And, it's interesting, is who goes first in the journey more important, or is consistency of decision making driving to the outcome? And I'd really emphasize the point, as we've touched on a few times here, that clarity of outcomes and making sure the interaction between different interventions considers their role in these broader systems is the piece that's really critical. It's the piece that stands out in terms of the work in the UK from the Infrastructure and Projects Authority. It's a type of logic that underscores the thinking of the Institution of Civil Engineers through their Enabling Better Infrastructure initiative. And it's the type of consideration that went into the 2021 Australian Infrastructure Plan developed by Infrastructure Australia.
It's not easy. I think that's probably a one sentence summary of the whole thing. Um, Many people seem to focus on their immediate area of environment. Like you work on a project, you focus on your project, and you don't really put too much brain power on the question whether the money spent for your project may be better off spent somewhere else. So you need to take this higher up, this decision making, and then have someone or a group of people who really have this very wide perspective, and at the same time also the decision making power to really have an impact and to really say, no, you guys over there, you don't work on that road project, instead you do something to improve, I don't know, cycleways, or build the railway line instead, or something like that. So it's, I mean, I must admit your vision and the connection of those three things that you were talking about was quite compelling, and certainly I can clearly see that improvements in those three areas would have a mutual effect, like almost a chain reaction, or a positive upward spiral. But getting there is probably the trick, yeah, where a lot of work needs to be done.
Well, let me just give one call to action to help with people who want to lean into this issue. So the John Grill Institute for Project Leadership, part of the University of Sydney, is partnered with the Australian Constructors Association and Consult Australia to develop the Major Project Reform Roadmap. You can access it via the John Grill website and sign on, commit yourself or your organisation to being part of the change, investing in thought leadership and indeed adoption and delivery of change in these three areas. There's a synthesis report developed after a workshop involving more than 50 senior project leaders from government, industry, and academia early this year. And the Institute and a series of working groups are now working through implementation of change in these areas. So it's not just pointing to a problem or a shortcoming, but a really clear and considered roadmap of practical, implementable action, and a huge encouragement to everyone who's listening to this podcast to jump on the John Grill Institute's website, sign on to the reform roadmap, and be part of delivering the change, not just talking about it.
Good. Well, I for once will certainly have a look at that, and maybe we talk about after the conversation how to put some of these things in the show notes to make it easier for the listeners to find. Peter, thank you very much for your time. I was not disappointed in that becoming a very interesting episode, and I'm pretty optimistic that the listeners, most of them, will find the same. Thank you very much for your time, and I really do hope that your visions for the future of the industry will become reality sooner rather than later.
Thanks so much for having me on Railway Conversations.
Thank you. Bye bye. Hi, this is Doc Frank from the studio. I want to inform you about my latest and greatest training development, and it is all about the mindset of a high capacity railway organization. What I found in my experience of training and consulting is that often you have projects for new technology which seem to be perfectly planned, which are very well executed, and they still don't lead to the success that was expected. And very often the reason for that is mindset. Key stakeholders that have what I call a legacy mindset, an outdated old ways of thinking where the new technology is treated in the same way as the old one, but it's just not suitable to get the most out of the new technology. This course, which is called High Capacity Railway Mindset, provides you with weekly training modules over 12 weeks. Each module has a lesson with 5 examples of a legacy mindset, the potential issues with that, an alternative expression from a high capacity mindset that is more suitable for the new world with the new technology, and suggestions how to adopt such a high capacity mindset. Every module also includes a second lesson called Transformation Guide, which provides you with more general tips and tricks how to change your mindset or anything else you might want to change in your life. So in total, the entire training offers 60 examples of a shift from a legacy mindset to a high capacity mindset and 12 transformation guide lessons. This is not only the most comprehensive training on this topic, it is the only training worldwide at the time I record this for you. You can watch all lessons on demand whenever it suits you, from where you prefer, and as often as you like. And then you have the usual service of an alumni community afterwards where you can ask ongoing questions for at least 12 months after the training. You find more information and you can sign up on my training portal docfranktraining.podia.com/mindset. I hope I see you at this training. It's really leading edge stuff. Nobody else in the world is training on this. And if you really want to explore the ultimate frontier of success in technology projects, then this is the training you need to take. Hi, it's Doc Frank again. I hope you liked today's episode. I like to keep it as simple as possible, so I only have one single request for you. If you like this podcast, please tell your friends and colleagues about it. That's all I want, because that's a service that I'm providing to the industry, and I would like as many people as possible to listen to this podcast and learn something from it. So please share, and until next time, keep it simple and bye for now. Thank you for listening.